Welcome back to Three Go Searching by Patricia St. John. Chapter 12, Out of the Shadows. Leela stood looking after the car until it was only a little cloud of dust far away where the road met the horizon. Then she turned and climbed the hill, limping a little because she was very tired. Never before, even on the day that her mother had died, had the future seemed quite so dark. She had only been a little child then, and she had known that someone would have to look after her somehow. But now she was older, and she had learned to be afraid. She knew now that life could be when she did not belong and was not wanted. It would be very well if she were strong and able to work, but sometimes the loads she had to carry were just too heavy for her, and her twisted back ached dreadfully. A new master might give her even heavier loads to bear, and a new mistress might be far less kind than the present one. She sat on the root of an olive tree that straggled across the path and looked back along the white road. It was dark now, but a sickle-shaped moon hung in the sky, and the silver leaves of the tree rustled softly. She had longed for this day, and now it had come and gone. David, whom she loved, would be halfway home, his head snuggled against his father's shoulder. And she might never see him again. There were many little villages, and anyhow, he was soon going to go to school. She went over the events of the day, one by one, in her mind, lingering especially over that last hour. The group of men and women gathered around the doctor, listening attentively, for the most part. He had talked about a refuge, and Leela sat for a long time, her head resting on her knees, trying to remember every word. Jesus had taken away the barrier of sin. Jesus had opened the way to the refuge. She could run, as it were, to those open arms of love. She need never feel lonely or forsaken again. She must not forget. Oh, if only she had the book and could read about it. She got up and hurried up the path. As she neared the hut, she could hear her master calling angrily, and she realized with a start how long she had been. "Lazy girl!" shouted her master, picking up his stick threateningly. "Running after strangers when you are needed at home. Go over to the house of my wife's sister and tell my wife to come. It is time she cooked my supper." The older babies, unwashed and unfed, had fallen asleep, curled up together like two kittens on the mud floor. Leela, feeling very guilty, lifted them onto the mattress and covered them. Then she hurried down the hill to the hut by the river, where a tiny oil lamp burned in the darkness. The room was full of neighbors, but they sat very quietly, waiting for the change to come. Then they would wail and beat their breasts in hopeless grief. Leela hardly liked to break the silence by slipping in around the curtain to where her mistress crouched beside her sister. But no one seemed to notice her as she touched the woman gently on the arm. "Come," she whispered, "your husband waits for you and orders you to come now." The woman rose with a burst of tears, stooped to kiss the pale face, and followed Leela out into the night weeping. She longed to stay, but her husband must be obeyed. She would never see her sister again. Death would steal her away before she returned. "I wish they knew about heaven," thought Leela, hurrying along behind her mistress. "I wish they knew the verse I learned in the hospital. Jesus said, 'I go to prepare a place for you. I wish they knew the hymn we learned at the ward service. There's a beautiful country. I wish someone would come back and tell them all. Then they would not weep and wail at death as they do now. I think I would not be sad to die. I think I would be glad to go to a beautiful home, because I shall never have a home here. Perhaps if I knew more, I could tell them. But who would listen to a servant child? They had reached home by now. Leela's master sat half asleep, lulled by his pipe. No one spoke. His wife's silent sorrow shamed him a little, and he sat quietly while she prepared the meal. But neither she nor Leela were hungry, and the man ate alone. Suddenly, the silence of the night was broken by the loud crying of a child. And a moment later, the curtain was pulled aside, and a girl of about 12 ran into the room and flung herself on the floor beside them. "Dead!" cried the girl. "Gone! Oh, what shall I do? Where shall I go?" Leela's mistress gave a cry too and gathered the child into her arms. They rocked to and fro, moaning and crying their hopeless grief. Then the woman spoke through her tears, without a single glance at her husband. "You shall come to me, little one," she said. "Are you not my sister's child? Is this not your home?" Her husband stopped cleaning the plate with his bread and looked up sharply. "We cannot have two girls," he said. "If this one comes, Leela will have to go." No one argued the point. Leela shrank into the shadows, and the moaning and crying went on softly. Then her mistress told her to clear the supper, and, bidding good night to her husband, she went off to join the mourners in her sister's house. Leela washed the bowl and lay down beside the sleeping babies. But she could not sleep. She knew that time was very short. Unless she could make up her mind, it would be made up for her very quickly. Once she got into the clutches of someone who needed her to work, she might never escape. "I will pray to God and ask him to show me what to do," she said to herself. "If he truly loves me, he will show me. He will lead me to some refuge. I will pray like they do in the hospital, with my eyes shut and my hands folded." And so she lay, silently talking in her heart to the one she was beginning to know. And when she had told him all about her trouble and had asked him to show her exactly what to do, she lay awake far into the night, weighing in her mind all the possibilities. The priest of the village needed a servant, and unless God answered her prayer quickly, she would probably be given to him. He had 2 wives who quarreled all day long, and she felt she would rather die than go to him. Yes, she would far rather die and go to the beautiful country whose gates were open wide to those whose sins had been forgiven. She had once asked David what it was like, but he had not been able to tell her much. He only knew that it was very, very beautiful, and he thought there was a river there and the streets were made of gold. That, at least, would be smoother than the stony paths of the mountains. Her thoughts wandered to that sunny winter afternoon when she had sat on the hospital sun porch in a wheelchair, and David had sat on the wall, swinging his legs. She could see him so clearly in her mind, his blue eyes and freckled face and rumpled fair hair. David, how she loved him. She lay thinking about him, smiling in the dark, and perhaps she fell asleep, for she seemed to be standing at the bottom of a high hill. And it must have been early in the morning, because although she was in a shadowed place, the crest of the hill was bathed in sunshine. She could see David far, far ahead, running upward toward the summit, very small and alone in those vast distances. And in her dream, she called to him, and he turned back to see if she was following. And when he saw her, he pointed to the sunlight and beckoned her to come. And she began to climb the steep, rough track. But she was moving fast because she thought he was waiting for her. "David," she cried, "wait for me, I'm coming." Then, suddenly, a great boulder seemed to leap from the mountain and strike her, and she woke, trembling and crying in the dark. But it was no boulder. It was just her master prodding her with his foot because she was crying out in her sleep. She lay very still, although wide awake, and her master lay down and was soon snoring. Her dream had faded, but her prayer had been answered, and she knew perfectly and clearly now what she had to do. David had called her, and at the earliest opportunity she would go to him. She thought she could go that same morning because it was market day, and many traveled on the roads. She was so sure that this was her answer that she soon fell asleep and slept peacefully until daybreak. Then she crept from under the blanket she had shared with the babies, tied her few ragged garments into a bundle, and tiptoed out the door. Her mistress had come home and lay sleeping with the motherless girl in her arms. Already the marketers were setting out, and Leela joined them. One or two asked her where she was going, and she told them she had to go to the hospital. They supposed that the doctor had told her to come, so they showed no surprise. "But it is a long way for a child like you with a twisted back," said their neighbor, who was driving a horse loaded with sacks. "Come, you shall sit on the turnips until we reach the road." Leela enjoyed her ride on the turnip sacks. The world looked rather like her dream. The valley path was still shadowed, but the sun was kissing the tops of the hills, and the dew lay thick on the grass. The horse was fresh and trotted briskly along, passing bands of women, bowed almost double under their loads of charcoal. The little mountain road was thronged with marketers, all trying to reach the town early. But the sunlight had crept down to meet them before they came in sight of the main road. By the time the town came into view, the sun had climbed high in the sky, and the houses were so white, and the sea was so blue, that Leela thought again of the bright city whose gates were closed to sin. Only she knew there was plenty of sin in the marketplace, and was anxious to get away from it. The kind neighbor put her down on the cobbles and pointed out the road to the hospital. Leela hesitated a moment, and then she said, "Sir, will you speak a word to my master?" "Yes, I will," said the neighbor. "I will say shame on him to send a crippled child so far alone." No, no," said Leela. "He does not know I've come. But he has another girl now, and he does not want me. Tell him I'm going to stay at the hospital. Tell him he need not ask for me, because I have found a home. And may God have mercy on you." The man was surprised. "Yes, I will give him your message." He started to unload his turnip sacks, and Leela hurried through the streets that led to David. She had not really thought out what she was going to say. There was only one thing clear. David had called her, and she had come. But as she climbed the hill, she began to feel uneasy. How would she explain? What if they had no room and told her to go back? They had sent her away from the hospital, even when she had wanted to stay very much indeed, because someone else needed her bed. Oh, what would she do if they sent her back now? The thought slowed her eager feet. When she reached the hospital gate, she stopped. People were going in and out, and nobody was asked to stay. Perhaps she would wait a little until she felt calmer. She wandered along the road, then went along the side of the road to the cliff top. She sat down in the very place where she had lain so ill before David had led her master to the hospital. Staring out over the sea, her head resting on her arms, she gave herself up to her hopes and fears. She forgot that she had had nothing to eat all day except a raw turnip, which she had nibbled on the journey, for she was hungry and thirsty for something more than food. If only she knew more about God, her refuge. If only she knew what he wanted her to do. If only she could read the book where all the secrets of his love and comfort were written down so plainly. But would anyone ever have time to teach her to read? She was too old to go to school, and the nurses were all so busy, and David was too young. If she could read, then she would not mind going back so much. She felt she could face anything if she could only read from that book. Worn out by her sleepless night, her longing, and her hunger, she fell fast asleep and slept long and deeply. When she awakened, the sun was going down over the sea. She jumped up quickly, for she no longer had any choice of what to do. It was too late to go back to the village, and she could not stay out at night. She must go to the doctor's house now, whether she liked it or not. She wandered slowly toward the hospital, and by the time she reached the gate, it was getting dark, and passers-by looked at her curiously, wondering why she stayed so late in the road. She turned and walked through the gate, but when she reached the house, she did not knock at the door. She stepped aside and peeped in at the window where the light was shining. David's mother sat on the couch with Joan on her lap and David and Wafi at her feet. She was reading to them from the book, and blue eyes and black eyes were fastened on her. In her longing to hear, Leela forgot her shyness. She walked straight in at the door without knocking at all and sat down beside the little boys. They were greatly surprised to see her and wanted to ask all sorts of questions, but she silenced them with a wave of her hand. "Go on," she said, "and let me listen. Afterward, I will tell you all." So they went on, and she heard for the first time the story of the sisters at Bethany, weeping for their dead brother, and how Jesus turned their sorrow to joy. Leela's thoughts flew back to the wailing women in the village and the poor sufferer who died in the dark and had never heard the name of Jesus or known about eternal life. Oh, if only they knew! Had no one the time to go and tell them? She turned sharply on David as the story drew to a close. "Are there many people in your country?" she asked. "Hundreds," said David. "In fact, I think millions." "Why? Can they all read that book?" demanded Leela. "Yes, everyone can read in England," answered David proudly. "Why, then, don't they come and tell us all?" cried Leela. "What are they doing? No one in our village knows anything about it." "I suppose they are too busy doing other things," said David. "Or perhaps they don't know." "Well, teach me to read," said Leela decidedly, "and I will go back and tell them when I'm older." "But they won't listen to you," put in Wafi softly. "If my father knows I'm a Christian, he'll punish me. I haven't told him yet, and if I do, he'll be very angry. I don't think he'll let me learn any more. But when they see that you are willing to be punished for it, and that Jesus is so precious to you that you won't give up, even if you are punished, then they will begin to believe, said David's mother. And then she forgot all the questions she was going to ask Leela. She even forgot David and Joan. She forgot everything except the two little disciples sitting at her feet, drawn by the love of Christ into a path which, if followed, must lead at times to bitter loneliness and persecution. And leaning forward, she began to teach them as clearly as she possibly could how great things they must suffer for his name's sake.